For my thoughts on all the latest happenings in the NFL in a completely relaxed, unscripted format, be sure to check out my channel, JG9 News. And now, on with our feature presentation. I want to give you this bizarre hypothetical scenario. Suppose you currently live in Orlando, Florida, but you're not crazy about living there. Why? Well, you were born in Jacksonville, but Orlando is too close to home. You don't want to be close to where you grew up. You don't want to see your parents, you don't want to be able to just go home whenever you want on a whim, and you just want a fresh start. You need to get out of Orlando and go somewhere that is not near Jacksonville so you can truly flourish and fly on your own. So you decide to move from Orlando to the city of Savannah, Georgia. That wouldn't seem to make a whole lot of sense, right? The distance between Jacksonville and Orlando is, for all intents and purposes, the same as the distance between Jacksonville and Savannah, so about 140 miles. However, if anything, it takes less time to get between Jacksonville and Savannah than it does to get between Orlando and Jacksonville, because Orlando traffic is notoriously bad, and it's a straight shot from Savannah to Jacksonville compared to Orlando, where no one knows how to drive, and there's traffic jam after traffic jam after traffic jam. So the logic makes no sense. You don't want to live in Orlando because it's too close to Jacksonville, but you're happy to move to a city that is just as far away from Jacksonville, and if anything, is worse for what you're looking for. Well, I bring all that up because when it comes to this man right here that you've been watching this whole time, North Carolina running back Ethan Horton, he employed some, shall we say, strange and bizarre logic during the 1985 NFL Draft. He was basically begging and hoping in his mind that he wouldn't get drafted by one particular team. He got his wish and got drafted by another team and loved it. But this team was in a worse situation than the team he didn't want to go to. And I don't mean that this is subjective and a matter of opinion. This is not based on his personal feelings or anything along those lines regarding what team gave him the best chance to compete or what team gave him the best chance to start and contribute right away. This is completely objective, where you take a listen and think to yourself, wait, nothing about this makes any sense. Did this guy really just say that? Does this guy know anything? Because this is the story of UNC running back Ethan Horton, and nearly 40 years later, how he made headlines in the 1985 NFL Draft in just about the strangest way possible. Before I talk about the bizarre comment that Horton made after getting drafted that seemed to make no sense when you thought about it for more than 2 seconds, we need some context to understand just who Ethan Horton was, and how good of a player he was to get drafted in the first round. The year is 1985, and the Kansas City Chiefs have a massive problem at the running back position. After the absolutely tragic death of Joe Delaney in 1983, for the past 2 seasons, the Chiefs have been struggling to find any sort of production on the ground, and it was costing them dearly. In 1983, the Chiefs had the worst rushing offense in football, with not a single runner on the team having 500 or more rushing yards. The Chiefs were so bad on the ground that not only were they over 800 yards under the season-wide average across the league, and not only did 6 teams have more than double the rushing yards that Kansas City had, but they were 100 yards worse than the next worst team in football, as Kansas City only had 1,254 rushing yards, or 78 per game, in 1983. For some more perspective, their leading rusher was Billy Jackson, who ranked 41st in a 2018 league in rushing yards. And in 1984, they were not much better. The Chiefs improved from the worst rushing attack in football to the second worst rushing attack in football, still averaging well under 100 yards per game at a time when that was incredibly uncommon. If the Chiefs were going to be good in 1985, bolster their offense, and make it back to the playoffs for the first time since 1971, then they desperately needed to improve the running back position. And with that, in the first round with pick number 15, they drafted the man they've been watching this whole time, none other than North Carolina running back Ethan Horton. Head coach John Malkovich unsuccessfully tried recruiting him at Wake Forest before taking the job with the Chiefs, and now that he had the opportunity to get him and bolster the running game, he was going to do it. Said Malkovich on why the Chiefs drafted Horton, he is a player who can carry 20 times a game and do it effectively. He punishes the defense. He's had amazingly quick recovery from injuries. He's strong and durable. He'll have a real influence on our team. The halfback option pass will be a part of our offense because he is a very skilled athlete. He will be an excellent receiver coming out of the backfield. That is extremely high praise, and it's not hard to see why, because when Horton was at UNC, he was nothing short of sensational, as you're able to tell from these highlights. After coming onto the scene off the bench at the 1981 Gator Bowl and winning MVP of that game, he became an instrumental part of North Carolina's offense while with the team, finishing his collegiate career with over 3,000 rushing yards and 27 touchdowns from scrimmage, along with the MVP of the Sun Bowl in 1982. In 1983, his 1,107 rushing yards led the entire ACC, and he followed it up for an encore in 1984 with 1,247 rushing yards, which not only finished 7th in the NCAA, but also led the ACC. This made Horton just the 5th player in ACC history at the time to lead the conference in rushing yards in back-to-back seasons. Horton was an All-American in 1983, had his number 12 jersey honored by the school, was an All-ACC first-team member in 1983 and 1984, was named the ACC Player of the Year in 1984, and ended his career at the time with the 5th most rushing yards in school history, thanks in part to 17 games during his time with the Tar Heels, where he ran for over 100 yards. Long story short, Horton was an exceptional player in college, and he got drafted super high as a result, though the process was rather unconventional. He watched the draft on TV, then turned it off because he had to take a math exam, so he was taking the test and had no idea if and when he was going to get drafted, and if so, by whom. The draft was very different back then than it is today. Said Horton, "When I first went into the exam, I was concentrating on the draft. Then I sat there for a while and thought I'd better start putting something on paper. A secretary called me into her office and told me where I had been picked. That made the rest of the exam easier." Horton was the first running back off the board, and he was happy to be in Kansas City, ready to hopefully turn Kansas City's putrid rushing offense around. And that's where things got bizarre, because later on during his phone interview with the media, Horton was asked about what it was like to get drafted and what his day entailed. And when he was asked this, Horton said, "I watched the draft on TV until the Detroit Lions' choice at pick number 6, because they had expressed interest in me. I was kind of hoping they'd choose somebody else besides me. Detroit is a cold weather city, and it didn't appeal to me. So let me get this straight. You're excited to be in Kansas City, but you absolutely did not want to go to Detroit because you don't like playing in the cold, and because it's a cold weather city? I'm sorry, what? There is so much wrong with this statement that I don't even know where to begin, but screw it. We've got to break it down. And I'm not even talking about the fact that he spoke about not wanting to play for a particular team, which is something that 99.9% of prospects do not do after getting drafted. Most people talk about how grateful they are, not, "Thank God it wasn't that other team that picked me." But the fact that you said this after getting drafted by the Kansas City Chiefs, I don't even know what to say. If you said this after getting drafted by the Miami Dolphins, or the New Orleans Saints, or the Los Angeles Rams, alright, different story. But the Chiefs? Kansas City? The average temperature in Detroit and the average temperature in Kansas City is about the same. Detroit can get brutally cold in the winter, and Kansas City can get brutally cold in the winter. Just ask the fans 4 decades later when the Chiefs played the Dolphins in the playoffs, who went to the game and got frostbite and had to get parts of their body amputated due to the freezing weather. Just ask the fans 3 decades later when the Chiefs played the Steelers in the playoffs, when the game got delayed because of a freaking ice storm, which you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. With any basic geographic knowledge, you know that Kansas City is cold. Here's a graph showing the average low temperature by month in Kansas City and in Detroit. They're pretty similar. In fact, during the month of November, Kansas City and Detroit both reach an average low temperature of 36 degrees, exactly the same. During football season, the average low temperature across the 4 months in Kansas City is 42 degrees, and the average low temperature across the 4 months in Detroit is 40 degrees, so a super marginal difference. It's not Tampa or Miami that we're talking about here. I don't know how you can say, especially after getting drafted by Kansas City, that you're glad you didn't play in Detroit because it was too cold, when the two cities are practically identical from a temperature standpoint. But it gets even worse, because if you really don't want to play football in the cold, you know what a great city to do that it is? That's right, Detroit, because Detroit has a dome. The Detroit Lions play all of their games at the Pontiac Silverdome. It's a nice 72 degrees in there all the time. That dome was built a decade ago. It's not going away anytime soon. But you know what's not a good city to play in if you want to avoid the cold weather? The brutally cold outdoor venue known as Arrowhead Stadium in Kansas City. Here's a graph showing the temperature of each of the 8 home games that the Lions had in 1984, as in the year before Horton got drafted, and the temperature of the 8 home games that the Chiefs had. Gee, one of these seems way warmer than the other one. One of these seems less than ideal if you hate playing in the cold, seeing as the average temperature inside Arrowhead across the 8 games was 49 degrees, or 23 degrees colder than the climate-controlled Silverdome. And just to prove that this wasn't a fluke, here's what it looked like for 1983. While playing in Week 16 against the Denver Broncos, when the temperature is 1 singular degree, and we're in the negative Celsius range. And I want to make it very clear, I have no problem with players having personal preferences in terms of where they want to play. Maybe it's not the best idea to publicly express them, but I'm not delusional. We're all human, and no player wants to go to all 32 teams equally. You want to go to a particular city or play for a particular coach more than others. You have your dream destination. If you love your hometown, you value your family, and you feel comfortable there, of course you'd rather be drafted by your hometown team than a team across the country. If the NFL team is coached by your coach from college, yeah, you want to play for him. Believe me, I get it. But if you're going to give a reason for why you didn't want a team to draft you, maybe saying, I hate playing in the cold, when you wind up not only getting drafted by another cold weather city that has super comparable temperatures, but wind up playing for a team with an outdoor venue while the team you didn't want to play for played in a dome, might not be the best strategy in the world, and might not seem to make a whole lot of sense. I don't think you thought that one through all the way. Just some food for thought. And what's crazy about the man that got drafted by this team behind me right here is the fact that this was the 1985 NFL draft. As in, the same draft class that Buster Rhymes was in when he got drafted by the Minnesota Vikings. You might recall that last week, I did a video on Buster Rhymes, and how after he got drafted by the Minnesota Vikings, he said that he was excited because he had never been to Ohio before, and wanted to play for a team in Ohio. Because he legitimately thought for some reason that Minnesota was the name of a town in Ohio, and not, the name of a state. You can learn more about that by clicking the card in the upper right corner. How were there multiple prospects in the 1985 NFL draft that are so bad at geography? Like, did anyone at any point in their life ever look at a map? What is this? The career of Ethan Horton in the NFL was a super bizarre one. He lasted just 1 year with the Chiefs, that was it, as Kansas City cut ties with him going into the 1986 season, getting no compensation in return. He did absolutely nothing with the Chiefs, picking up 331 yards from scrimmage. That was it. He might be the biggest bust in Chiefs history, and they've had quite a few. However, despite being out of the NFL by 1986, he signed on with the Raiders in 1987, was out of the NFL again in 1988, and then Al Davis wanted to bring him back and switch his position from running back to tight end, where he actually became a really good player, and even made the Pro Bowl in 1991 when he had 53 catches for 650 yards and 5 touchdowns. This might have to be a future long-form video, because he went from an NFL laughingstock to a Pro Bowl player with a change of position after flaming out of the league twice. But I'm not sure you can be too surprised that his Kansas City career was not successful, considering the fact that he didn't want to play in the cold weather and thought somehow that going to Kansas City would fix that problem. So as a word to the wise, if you get drafted in a few weeks by the Chicago Bears, don't say that you're glad it wasn't the Minnesota Vikings because you hate playing in cold weather. If you get drafted in a few weeks by the Green Bay Packers, don't say you're glad it wasn't the Indianapolis Colts because you hate playing in cold weather. Just use some logic. That's all I ask of you. Use some logic. Any logic so that my head doesn't hurt. Because after the 1985 NFL Draft, Horton didn't hear a who. He heard the sound of thousands of people scratching their heads. Get your official Jaguar Gator 9 merchandise by going to jj9shop.com, and be sure to like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out a lot. Join me every Wednesday night where we'll play NFL Trivia for cash prizes at 9 p.m. Eastern over on Twitch. To learn more about the history of college football, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To learn more about the history of Major League Baseball, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 7. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.